Hi, everyone. I want to first apologize for my voice if it cracks during my recovering, so hopefully it'll be fine. And if I cough in the middle as well, it's pretty. So the paper I'm going to talk about today, so it can give some motivation. I don't think I have to motivate too much for this crowd, but the key question that is behind this paper is, what are we doing to fight climate change? When we think about, actions we're doing, we usually tend to think about adaptation or mitigation. And for both of these questions, we have two key components, right? First, we have to develop technologies. What technologies, are we, innovating at? This could be, for adaptation, we could talk about, we're dealing with floods or climate impacts or weather shocks. When we talk about mitigation, it could be something like what I'm going to talk today, which is, the energy transition and trying to, move towards cleaner energy. So when we talk about both of these questions, we're thinking about first, why are we innovating? And then second step, which is how are we bringing these technologies to the market? Right? And it could be either from a supply side, and what I'm going to focus on here is, once we have these technologies and they're scalable in production, how do we bring those into, scale up enough in adoption that they actually make an impact? So the question I'm thinking about is, what drives firms to adopt these greener technologies once we get to the market stage? And what I'm going to focus on is solar energy, specifically small scale. So I'm not thinking utility scale. This is small, think rooftop solar, okay? But what I'm really thinking about is what this photo is showing, which is at the firm level, okay? So this is a resort in the Brazilian coast. They have solar panels on top of the hotel, so this is what I'm thinking about. So this is firm. So I'm not just thinking services, I'm thinking also industrial. So anything that's, at the firm level where I'm substituting away from grid electricity into rooftop solar. So what am I talking about small scale? Well, small scale solar has particular benefits when compared to utility scale, which is they can prevent low emission generation at low marginal costs, but it also has the ability to provide electricity at off-peak times. So it avoids some of the issues that we have. For example, you can insulate firms and households from price fluctuations when you can generate your own electricity in situ. Firms specifically have an even greater gain from small-scale solar, so rooftop solar, precisely because they can avoid grid reliance and avoid these peak time congestion that we know is an issue with renewable energy generation. Firms also, represent a very large share of energy consumption worldwide, so this is particularly an important option for adoption. And my setting is going to be Brazil, which is a particularly interesting setting because solar has already kind of gained a lot of, has made a lot of gains in terms of total generation. And small scale has been kind of growing extensively and it's already looking to be almost 70% of total solar generation in the country. So this is what I'm talking about. When I'm talking about adoption, this is basically showing you the share of total firms that are have adopted small-scale solar. Okay, this has grown specifically most recently after 2016. I don't have the data here for after 2020, but 2021 and 2022 have been especially boom years for this. But adoption is very unequal. So there's a lot of dispersion in adoption, not firms everywhere, not every firm is adopting. So clearly there is some heterogeneity that's driving this adoption. So what my paper is going to look at is precisely, this question of what's driving new technology, specifically renewable solar generation. And I'm going to try to do three things in this paper, which is first, provide evidence of how energy prices are affecting adoption. And I have a very specific setting for this where a subsidy exists through energy prices. I'm going to try and show some evidence of this patterns of adoption across firms, and finally estimate a model to capture these mechanisms behind adoption. So I'm going to focus on the first two today. If I have time, I'll go through the model as well. So just a preview, I'm going to take advantage of this net metering subsidy that was put in place in 2012. It exists to this day, which is basically giving a subsidy in the total energy price that you pay for your energy consumption if you adopt small-scale solar. This is for households and firms. Also, public buildings, basically anyone, if you adopt and you take up the net metering scheme, you pay a subsidized energy price. And what I find is that there's a clear significant effect of this policy on adoption. So I find a significant, I find a positive price elasticity of 1.07, which is kind of close to what the literature has found for energy, for price subsidies for households, for firms only. And I also find that a 10 percentage point increase in the share of your total energy bill that is subsidized. I'll get into the details of what I mean by this. Leads to a 22% increase in investment. So a very large effect of the subsidy itself. And then the second thing I'm going to show is for the firm level adoption, I'm looking at peer effects. So basically, if you have neighbors adopting, how much more likely are you to adopt as well? I have some next steps on this that I'm going to do that I'm not going to present today, which is basically looking at, the key my calling card for this is basically what are the social drivers for firms adopting solar. So, how do political preferences as well and energy intensity for mostly manufacturing firms, how do these also relate to adoption? Today, I'm going to present the peer effects only. This relates to several strands in the literature. So first, PV adoption, which has mostly so far focused on households. I think the contribution here really is trying to understand how firms can actually play a big role in this, bringing this small scale solar to market. And, in terms of green technology, diffusion, I think my main contribution really is on showing how, the energy transition can also play a relevant role in this, in diffusion of technologies from the firm side. And also, I didn't add this, but I do have, I should add another bullet point, which is on the model part, trying to identify precisely how are these mechanisms happening for the firm decision compared to the literature that so far has mostly looked at households only. Any questions so far?
I guess one thought is if the electricity and the is mainly from hydro,
yeah,
which is clean, this going to have a big impact on climate change, or is this more just costs and it's reducing costs for firms? And is there a kind of climate change angle in the paper? Is it more?
So I do have, I mean, hydro, yes, definitely more clean, I guess, than most, but in Brazil, there's also a lot of discussion about hydro having, local environmental impacts as well that tend to be very large, precisely with big dams. Some of them, have been built in, environmentally protected areas, and then you have this discussion as well. Small scale solar doesn't have that issue. But also I'm thinking about, if we can understand a little bit better how firms are making this, this choice. I think this is a relevant question for settings, for example, in Africa, where we know that grid infrastructure is very complicated, very tough to understand, how do you actually build out these infrastructures in places where you don't have them yet? And, clearly small scale solar offers an opportunity for firms in this country to kind of choose something that's going to have an large impact because you can, electrify without having to rely on grid infrastructure.
Yeah, this sort of relates to that, but do you put a pin in it if you're going to cover it in section 1, which is what is happening in the broader sector here? Should we think of grid connectivity and reliability and so on as changing alongside this in the period you study, or it's reasonably stable along the other dimension?
It's reasonably stable, yeah. So I'm not going to say anything about sort of extensive margin of connectivity. Electrification is pretty stable thus far. And the fact that I'm looking at firms, and I should say formal firms, is what I'm going to be looking at. And I don't think there's going to be any question of whether or not they were connected before and they weren't and they become connected.
And similarly with reliability, the grid, blackouts and so on.
Yeah. There have been historical issues with that in the past, but not in this period. Yeah. Yes.
Can I, on this, related to Robin's question on what are the incentives of firms there, it's everything, I guess, in your setting through pricing, right? There is this exogenous thing on prices and you're getting elasticity.
Yeah.
Is there anything that could be confounding in terms of regulation, command and control policies that would force firms, regardless of subsidies, to adopt this type of technology rather than others that are as clean as?
So I would say one thing is this policy, the subsidy exists if you want to adopt other forms of renewable generation as well, so biomass, wind, anything like that. But what we see is that solar is like 97% of what these grid connected small scale generators will choose. And the one thing I would say is that the relevant, I think, key component that firms will observe changing over time is the price of the panel itself.
Okay.
Right, so innovation, which we know, from a lot of papers, the difference really becomes the initial cost of investment. So that's also why, once I get to the model, that's going to be an important component, because then you can kind of separate of what is the impact of having the changing in the price. What if firms are have perfect foresight of how prices will evolve over time, and then how does the initial investment cost affect that compared to how do these subsidy components affect it? Any questions?
What sort of percentage of electricity are we getting from solar?
So maybe I should go into the data, yes. So basically, this project for, should we call it the big push for solar, started in 2012 with this policy. But it's been increasing most significantly in recent years. Again, I should say most of this comes from the cost of initial investments. But in recent years, it's already been quite relevant. So in 2024, for example, we had a point in time at which 30% of all national demand was supplied by solar. There have been initial studies going, trying to understand of how you can expand the small scale solar to vulnerable communities. Like I said, this is kind of the key thing of how you can expand electrification without great costs. The goal is to invest a lot, and solar is already, 18% of the energy matrix of the 2024, 70% of that is small scale, and almost 40% of it is in commercial and industrial generation, so firms adopting. So what I'm going to take advantage of as kind of an identification strategy here is precisely the subsidy that was put in place in 2012, which is basically energy tariffs consist of these two components, so a usage and a distribution component. The usage distribution is meant to compensate distributing utilities for the cost of electricity itself. So this includes both the cost that the utility will pay for the electricity that they're buying in the market, and the distribution component is meant to compensate them for fixed costs of maintaining the distribution grid. There's a lot of variation in this, and basically what the subsidy policy did was it cut this distribution tariff to zero, which is basically once you install a renewable small scale generator in your house, whether it's wind, biomass, or solar, it has to be up to 5 megawatts of installed capacity. Once you install, if you're still a net consumer of grid electricity, you will pay only the usage tariff for that. Yes.
Do I have the option to feed my own generation into the grid, or is that not?
You do, and then you get credit for that. So if you're a net supplier, you get a credit for how much you are net supplying to the grid. Okay. So what I'm going to take advantage of is the fact that this subsidy varies a lot across distributing utilities. So basically, there are some firms who are going to face a subsidy of about 30% of their energy bill, and others that are going to face up to 95% of their energy bill subsidized. Okay, so this is basically what I'm going to take advantage of. Yes.
Why is this variation?
So how these two components are determined are basically by the National Electricity Agency regulator. So it differs basically. I don't want to get too much into the details because it's a bit complicated, but the distribution tariff is basically just meant to compensate the costs of maintaining the grid. So if you're in a place where you can distribute that cost between a lot of consumers, basically your distribution component is going to be low because a lot of your consumers are contributing to a very small grid. If you're in a place, for example, that's very rural, your consumers are very far apart, you have to maintain a very large grid to supply to very few consumers, your distribution tariff might be lower. The usage tariff differs a lot. So one of the main components they say, for example, is if you have a lot of illegal consumers, we call it a cat connection to the grid, which is basically you're stealing energy. And then basically you have to, you have to compensate for that in your usage tariff. So that's also something that could vary for the usage tariff. Overall, I should say these utilities don't bid themselves on the energy that they're distributing. So they will tell the central regulator how much energy they require for their consumers, and the central regulator, so the government, is the one that bids in the auction from the generator, from the big utility generators. So they're not the ones making the bids, they're not the ones making the actual procurement in the utility market. Okay, yes.
Tell me if this is not at all true, but is it then the case that like for a new solar plant, most of that fixed cost recovery is going to like just consumers rather than these like industrial uses that are installing small scale solar?
Yeah. Yeah, so that's a big discussion. That was a big discussion when so the thing is that this policy became, it was just like a measure, and then they turned it into law. And when they were discussing this in Congress and whether or not to make it permanent, that was one of the big discussions, right? So you have to actually like redistribute the cost of loss of revenue into this, and that's the big question. So we don't know how much of this it's not been quantified. Maybe it's a different paper. That would be very interesting to know how much of it is actually coming to, Yes. Okay. So for the data, I'm going to use mainly the first two, which is the regulating agency for the electricity sector has micro data on this universe of adopters. This include households as well as firms, public buildings, etc. Which includes dates of registration if they ever update their installation, location, install capacity. They're responsible distributing utility and a firm ID, and also have energy tariff data. This is from the regulating agency. Basically, it has to approve how much the utilities can charge from the consumer. So these are also given for every period of time in this between 2010 and 2024. I know, what's the usage tariff and what's the distribution tariff. I should say both tariffs are paid based on consumption. So they're not fixed costs. So they're both variable on how much you consume. And then second, the HISE data, which is the initiative matched employee-employer data for all formal firms. So this is a universe of formal contracts. I'm going to use the firm level data, which I can match back to the microdata of adopters.
So it's the top data set. Are they all formal firms that are putting the solar on there?
Yes, it could also be just individuals. So it could just be, I put it in my house and then they have my.
But if it's a firm, it's
Yes.
going to be in rights.
Yes. Okay. Okay. And it has some irradiation data and some kind of socioeconomic data as well. Okay, so the first thing I'm gonna show you is this reduced form for the municipal level. So basically, I'm trying to find how, these elasticities of how price differences are affecting adoption. So this is interesting because I can look at the extensive margin as well as the intensive margin of adoption for the firm level as well. And secondly, I'm going to do for the firm level, which is first, I'm going to look at the price variable. So how does this variation in the price or the subsidy, how this is going to affect adoption, and as well as these peer adoption. So how much are your neighbors adopting? How much does that impact on your own probability of adopting? I'm going to show this for a sample of national for national representative, but I'm also going to show this for a specific for one state.
I guess you have these two regressions because you want to divide intensive and extensive margin,
Yes.
right? That's your goal.
Yeah.
And what you learn from the intensive margin, the municipality level that you wouldn't from the firm level? I'm asking because the richness of your data is really at the firm level,
Yes, so I
right?
haven't done the extensive margin for the firm yet,
Oh,
but I will do that. That's my
I
next
see,
one.
I see. Okay.
I haven't done everything I want to do it.
Okay.
Okay, and I should say, one caveat of this is that because the RISE data doesn't tell me to which utility you are connected, I have to match the tariff data at the municipality level. So I don't have variation within municipality of tariff, so that's something that I can't do. Okay, any other questions? So, what I'm going to try and identify is precisely these price mechanisms of, I would expect that if firms face higher energy prices, there's going to be a substitution effect between, the panel, or the solar and the grid supply. There's going to be a supply side from the net metering, and also a subsidy effect from the net metering. So basically what I find is clearly suitability is relevant and the energy price is also relevant. But mainly what I want to focus on is this, which is, I find that actually the price of how much you're actually going to get subsidized doesn't matter. What matters is the final price you're going to pay after the subsidy. So the usage component is what's really relevant for the decision, right? So it doesn't matter really how much, so the size of the subsidy matters, I'm going to show it, but what's really going to matter is what firms are really taking into account is how much am I going to have to pay after? Okay, so really what I'm seeing is, the usage component really is. When I look at the size of the tariff of the subsidy, I find this effect of 23%, which basically says that, if I'm going from 30 to 40% of my tariff is being subsidized, I see that investment increases by 23%. Okay. I also find this at the firm level. So this is usually using my national sample, and I also find that the usage tariff is the relevant and still quite significant. I'm going to come back to these results in a bit. So the first thing I want to say, when we look at the whole universe of firms, clearly there's some differences between adopters and the medium firm, right? So I see that firms that are adopting are older and larger than most firms in my sample. They're overrepresented in size and age, which tells me that there might be a story behind this of, the initial investment costs might be quite relevant. So credit constraints will be a relevant story for this. And, size could be a question of scale. Sometimes it's only worth investing if you have, sufficient enough scale. And what I find is that,
So just at the right end of that, is there some, given that you're focusing on these small installations, is there some sort of on the right that we should think of, at which point you just qualify out of your sample here?
do you mean like why am I cutting at 100?
No, I'm surprised you're not cutting before then.
Oh, okay, I see.
I don't know enough about solar installations to know whether that still qualifies as small. If you've got 100%, that seems like a big.
It is big, yeah, but so yeah, maybe I should.
What are you substituting between? And if you're substituting into, utility scale, at what point should we expect that just intuitively to be relevant? It reflects my ignorance of the scale of these things in this context.
Yeah.
Is this ever likely to be plausible as an option for an 80-person firm?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, absolutely. So 5 megawatt is quite large. It's quite a lot.
Okay.
So for example, the photo that I had in the beginning, which is the resort, I mean, that's a huge, some of these firms are really big and they're still adopting.
So we don't need to think about anything mechanically happening in the right technology.
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
No.
And are they selling electricity to the grid mostly?
No, so I don't know exactly how much because I don't have access to the actual billing data. But I would think no, that most of these is just, it's a partial substitution, so there's still net consumers in the end. From what this is anecdotal, this would be, anecdotal evidence.
Apparently now in India, that they're doing a lot of rooftop in the south. A lot of firms are making money.
So I'd say for the small ones, that could be absolutely the case.
Is there already a time frame for when the subsidies will be phased out? I was wondering if this could explain why they care more about the usage, that they know they would the 20 years in which they can use the solar panels, while maybe the subsidies will only last for a few.
So yes, when it was put in place, there was no foresight of ever ending, and then in 2022, they started discussions of making it a permanent subsidy, which is the case now. So a lot of these firms had already had guarantees that they would be kept on the same subsidy for like 30 years. And this has, now that after these passed into law, this is for sure permanent. Yeah. So I don't think there would be any case of like, the expected sequence of prices changing. So first, I want to show some pure effects results for my national sample. So I'm going to show results for this and for a specific state because adoption is quite, like I said, unequal. So in my national sample, I actually have a much larger share of firms actually adopting. And I'm going to show you after the case of a state where adoption is still quite low, which is São Paulo. Okay, so for my national sample, first what I'm going to see is that, again, I find, size and age are relevant and positive correlated with the probability of adopting. And the energy prices as well. And finally, the two that I want you to look at is, whether you've had a neighbor adopt, at least one neighbor adopt the year before, and whether you have a neighbor adopting the same year that you were also adopting. Okay, so what I'm finding is that there's a very clear positive increase in the probability that you were adopting if your neighbor adopted the previous, if at least one of your peer or neighboring firms adopted the previous year. And I'm defining a neighboring firm as a firm in the same zip code as you. So in a big city like São Paulo, for example, it's the side of a street block, a city block. If you're in a rural area, this could be much, much larger areas.
Are the controls only size and age, or do you have something else? I'm asking because we always saw that the log users have switches signs when you include controls, and I was wondering.
Yeah, so I have sector, region, state, I'm thinking what else do I have? Yeah, I think that's.
And so with that, you can explain that.
Yeah.
Yes. I wonder if you can tighten your comparison more by doing within term and cross establishment comparison.
Yes, so that's something that's the next steps of what I want to do as well. And also something else that I want to do for this as well is, if you are, is it more likely that you're going to adopt if your neighbor adopting is a larger firm versus a smaller firm?
This is also certainly a broader question, which is similar to something we came up this morning, which is, can you look at some of those things to try and understand the mechanism through which is happening? Are there fixed costs that are spatially relevant or firm relevant to Eddie's point about plants, or is this an information story that you could get at through a network story or something? Is there granularity you can see in the data that might tell you something about the mechanism here?
Yeah, maybe within firm, yes. I think so. I think from the fixed cost thing is, I tend to think it's more of an information and because it is more about. So the utilities basically know how to do this, which is you just basically have to change there is some technology that you have to install to be connected to do the net metering. But I do tend to think it's more of an information story. So there's a lot of
a labor specialization or local expertise or something that could be beyond an information.
I don't think so. Yeah. Yes.
Oh,
1 minute.
Yeah, so sorry.
Okay, sorry. I even had the timer. Okay. So what I'm just saying at the national level is that, having a neighbor adopt in the previous year gives, this probably was 27, at least one neighbor is 27.5%. Your 27% you're 2.7 percentage points more likely to adopt if at least one of your neighbors adopted the previous year. And you're more than twice as likely to adopt if your neighbors adopted the same year, which gives some intuitions about, these informations about, you're chatting to your neighbor firms and things like that. I'm gonna skip this and I'm gonna show this, which is basically, going from the first to third quartile of the energy price distribution increased probability of adoption by 71%. And the last thing, which is, depending on how many of your neighbors have adopted in the past, I should do this by firm size as well, but basically, you can increase by almost 50% your probability of adoption if you go from having no neighbors adopted to having at least 10 neighbors adopted in the previous year. And I'm gonna stop there because I'm gonna have time to make the model, so sorry, but thank you.